Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I will address people in the room as well. Let me see if I should put this larger. Here we go. Welcome, everyone, to a guest talk. We're very excited this morning to be welcoming to Texas State University, co-hosted by the MFA and BFA in Communication Design in the School of Art and Design, Leo Vicenti. I am a fan of your work. We met online. I guess it was Instagram based, and had the pleasure of attending a talk that you gave in Vancouver. What's VCC stand for?
Vancouver Community College.
I was thinking that, great. And we were not able to have our whole class join for your talk at Vancouver Community College because they had class conflicts. So Leo was generous enough to say, well, I could come give a talk in your class, which was really fortuitous because we had done some reading. We were looking at some exciting, contemporary Indigenous typographers. You were one of those people on our list, and some of the students in the room actually were researching your work already, and very, very excited about what you're doing. So it just seemed like everything sort of coalesced, and we're really happy to have you here today. I'm going to share my screen to welcome everyone to where we're situated. I just, in terms of introducing Leo, wanted to point people to your website if after your talk they wanted to see more of your work. My students have this. I don't know if Tuan's students have this. So just to recap, because that was before we started the recording, we have visitors in the Zoom room today who are joining us from St. Edward's University. They are also graphic design students, so your peers. They are in an experimental graphics class, and part of that class is type design. So I'm sure you all will connect since we are all in the same region, but it's nice to be here together on Zoom. Leo is a designer who, good morning, who is from here. So, sorry, I have to minimize my screen. We're looking at nativeland.ca, which I think the people in the room here are familiar with. We've looked at this map before. I'm just putting a link in the chat for people who, because we have people joining from different places geographically this morning, to sort of situate yourselves on native land. So Leo is from the Jicarilla Apache Nation, to situate you there, and is currently we go up here to the coast. I'm going to get lost. Here we are. Leo, you're around this area. You said you're south of Vancouver. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a little up and to the right. But yeah, that general area is where I'm at, that region.
Awesome. We are standing here in this room in San Marcos, Texas. This part of Texas is what is now called Texas, is one of the places on Turtle Island that is like one of the longest inhabited spaces, and has been a place that's been kind of a meeting place for trading or traveling through for millennia. But we are on the land, I just saw it, of the Coatlicon, the Miyakan Garza band of the Coatlicon. There we go, is their name for the spelling. It's the fourth one in the list there. The university is actually situated on a hill, and at the base of that hill is a spring. It goes by a name, the university gives it the name of Ocarina Springs, and it is an ecological research center. You may know it that way. It's also a sacred site at the Kuala. They have a powwow there annually, and they tell the story of the origins of their people emerging from that spring. So this is an incredibly important place we find ourselves on. And I just wanted to point everyone to the Indigenous Cultures Institute, which is located here in San Marcos. You can follow them on Instagram. They're doing a lot of really important work about repatriating ancestral remains around what is now the state of Texas and reconnecting people of Latinx heritage with their Indigenous roots. And they have events, and they have a lot of also educational posts on Instagram if you wanted to know more about the Indigenous culture of this place where you study, and all of the activities that are going on around sovereignty and repatriation and recognition. So that's just to situate us here, and people who are joining us from elsewhere, you may be able to find yourself on the native land map. So we start with that introduction, which is a typical start for an introduction, but especially meaningful today because Leo's work is centered in Indigenous identity and sovereignty, and the connection between that and language and typography. And so when we're working in typography and working in language, we remember that a language holds an entire worldview. A language is a culture. And so being able to express ourselves in our native languages is important in many dimensions, also like cultural, political dimensions. And so we have familiarized ourselves with your work, Leo. We're looking forward to seeing what you have to show us. And we'll reserve time at the end to have some conversation. And just let us know if there's any point during your talk where you want us to jump in and engage. I will make sure they stay awake here. This is our first class back from spring break, so
Yeah, no problem.
It's a wonderful way to come back. But welcome, Leo. I'll turn it over to you. How's the volume in here? Feel good? You can hear him? Okay, excellent.
All right. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, we're seeing the whole thing like with the preview. Yes, that's beautiful.
Awesome.
I'm gonna put it on, or no, I'll leave it off mute, but just let me know if there's kind of background noise that gets annoying. I can put it on mute. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. Well, yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there. I actually like better engaging with students and having that chance to talk in person. It's more informal the way I like to meet students. But yeah, this is my talk that I have today, which is kind of stems from some of the research that I'm doing. And yeah, it's entitled Indigenous Languages and Typographic Representations. I entitled it this because I'm still trying to develop this space. And I think that might be good insight for you as practitioners, because I think a lot of what I guess preach is that, not only with how we approach identity, but also, that's kind of our worldview. And we're able to make space within the design canon by defining what that is, and for me, it's really been about Indigenous languages, not only my own, but how it's kind of a relationship, especially when you look at typography. So I thought those were really interesting points for me as I, progressed through my career. I did have a video that I wanted to share, and I don't know if the audio is going to work, but I shared it last time, so I thought, well, why not I share it again?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. No, I haven't that's only the second time I've watched that in like the recent history, but that's just a short animatic that I was conceptualizing, in this kind of like journey. So I think I wasn't only thinking about like typography, but I was thinking about narratives. And then also just lettering and illustration. I think a lot of that was really interesting to me as I was like, pushing my studies forward. Um, but yeah, I can start. My name is Leo Vicenti. Abachi Miza. That's a linguistic signifier, pretty much stating that I'm a member of the Jicarilla Apache community. Um, yeah, and then the typefaces that you're looking at here in these couple of slides, those are actually a project I worked on last spring. So I was part of the 2023 cohort, online cohort at Type West, which is a type certification program based, it's actually ran by the Letterform Archive in San Francisco. So yeah, I thought this was a really interesting project, and I use the typefaces that I designed. So I think that's really interesting in a lot of ways. But this one in particularly is named Beshi, which it means the knife in Jicarilla. But essentially it's a revival of Ulrich Menhardt's copyrighted typeface Parliament, which was designed between 1950 and 1951. And Parliament was actually planned to print the Czech constitution. So, besides it being like very beautiful calligraphic like typeface, I also thought that it had a unique like conceptual like possibilities. And especially when thinking about like indigenous sovereignty, I think there was parallels in that space, which I really appreciated. And I think this was a really interesting project, it's one of the more advanced projects that I've taken on recently. But yeah, I in adding on to what M had already presented, I also like to do a land acknowledgement, and we can kind of like unpack this to a degree. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this presentation and Emily Carr are situated on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh and Stolo First Nations, also known as Vancouver. And our work and studies as artists, designers, and educators are deeply influenced by the values, tenets, and perspectives of the peoples of this land. In acknowledging the territory, we're stating that we have responsibilities, reciprocities, and commitments to this land that we now call home. I'd also like to acknowledge the Kwantlen and Semiahmoo First Nations through which I travel and reside on. Unceded means that First Nation peoples never ceded or legally signed away their lands to the Crown or to Canada. Aboriginal people in BC assert that most of BC remains unceded sovereign native lands, over which neither the Canadian nor BC governments have the legal or moral authority to govern. A traditional territory is the geographic area identified by a First Nation as a land they and or their ancestors traditionally occupied and used. So this is a pretty like big contrast. Before I was teaching in BC at Emily Carr, I was actually teaching in Chicago, and originally from New Mexico. I think it was unique to come into this space where land acknowledgements were a common thing, and I think that kind of like trend is only growing, across the globe and the continent. So I think this is one thing I really have to kind of like figure out like what my place is in relation to this. Also being a guest on this land, right, as an indigenous person. So I try and do my best, and part of this is making it something that I'm actively like working towards. So this text block is actually set in Arial, so I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Arial typeface. I also wanted to show a different typeface. This is actually set in Times New Roman. So, we have the sans serif and serif iterations. One thing that I have to kind of like manage with, and part of it's a big part of my classes too, as well, as like, how do we support these orthographies? You know, if we look at Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh, or even Stalo, we have all these characters, right? We have these diacritics. And I think those are things that we have to kind of like be able to manage once we enter this space. It's also, you know, important to recognize those communities in their chosen orthographies too. So, you know, I have those as well as the Romanizations, or the Latin typeset characters, or yeah, I think it's very important to kind of like have that as part of you know, my practice. And this next one is the same, but it's actually set in Beshi. So it's still definitely a work in progress, this typeface. One thing I'd like to point out in the top right, which is it's might be obvious or might not be easy to see from where you're standing, but the theta character, which is kind of like an O character or a zero with a strike through, that's not actually part of this typeface. And so we can actually pick that apart in the next slide. So here you can see those diacritics that I've highlighted, and those characters in the red. Those are part of that chosen orthography. And it's something that I'm still working through in terms of like the design, which, you know, it's very technical, but I think as we start working with typefaces and as we enter this space, it's really important that these be in you know, a developed state. But like I said, the theta, which is at the top in the center, which is this kind of like zero character with a strike through, all of these are kind of like off to a degree. As I switch it over to Arial, you can see some of those marks and how they change. And I'm just going to scroll back for once, and we can see the different diacritics and how those change in relation to the next. So I think those are things that I really focus on. And then we also have to, you know, especially here in BC, like how do we work with that? You know, how do we manage all of these diacritics, or how do I even find these characters, and how do I add diacritics onto them? So I think that was one thing that I'm trying to find solutions to, you know, in this practice. And here you can see the last one in Times New Roman. So we have a couple different flavors in how we can approach it. And I think that's one thing that's becoming more of like a focus, right? Like we have more opportunities to express ourselves, not only as individuals, but also as like communities as well. And the way that I like approach that daily, and the way that I do it in my classes, is that, you know, we're very much familiar with land acknowledgements, but like I said, in this land acknowledgement that I provided, like it should be something that we're finding out where we're in that situation, right, as an individual. So I actually started teaching type design this past fall, and I developed this type project, which it's a smaller abbreviated project. It's not a full character set, but it's a abbreviated like word mark. So I had students actually, you know, find that relationship with the host nation, because in Vancouver, you know, we don't just have one, you know, like nation that we are in relationship with, but we have multiple nations. And I think that's one thing that, you know, depending on the student, and you can see here, we have a variety of different nations that students chose in relation to where they're situated in Vancouver. But the project, it was actually a word mark. So they had to actually design the character set for that host nation. So they had to take into account all of those diacritics and that like typographic system for how you do that. But they also had to do the research for those host nations. They had to figure out, you know, what do they look at in terms of like visual culture or material culture, or where do they find inspiration? I think some of them were looking at art, some of them were looking at the land, and some of them were looking at other things that were actually inspiring that typeface concept. So I think this is a really interesting project to, start students off with, in terms of like not only going into like a more advanced like type design course, but also like developing your own ideas and concepts, right? And like especially for typography, like being able to voice that language, and that, which is really important for Indigenous communities, is that's a common theme across the continent, is that the language is really the holder of the culture. And so when you don't have the culture, or when you don't have the language, the culture is in danger of being lost. So that's one thing that we're trying to kind of like address in the type and type design like practices. But yeah, here's I have a couple other slides of these, and these are actually up in the Comedy studio at Emily Carr. So I was able to acquire a grant through Emily Carr to actually produce these on the risograph printer. So once the type design project, so we had two projects. This one is a land acknowledgement kind of project, a line project. The next one was actually their type design, their full character set. So on the other side of these posters, you can see the character set that they had taken on, which I wasn't able to show all of them, but I think some of these are really great. And in addition to getting the grant, we were also able to bring in Monique Ortman, who you can see her poster on the right, which really focuses on the Cherokee syllabary. So if you're not familiar with her, definitely give her a look at. I think her work is really interesting, and where she's going with that, and deciding that path for her design and her research. So these are all the students, as you can see with this little infographic of their posters. And yeah, I think it's just a really great project where we can actually apply these ideas of land acknowledgement, or thinking very critically and very thoughtfully about, if I'm starting a project, like how can that turn into something? But this work for me really started with like learning my own language. This is the dictionary of the Jicarilla Apache, it was put out, I believe, in 2003. And one of the contributors was actually my grandma at the top, Wilhelmina Phone. So on my mother's side, the maternal side, she was one of the big contributors to this book. And I really appreciated that. My mom actually gifted me this book when I was younger, and I was about to take on learning the language. One thing about the book is that the book it had a digital side to it. So if you go to this website that they provide in the book, you can actually look up headwords, you can look up random entries, browse the semantic fields, the text, and have more complex searches. So I thought this is really helpful, because I didn't always have access to the community. When I was going into academia, it was taking me away from the community. And so I didn't have those resources, or I didn't have those connections, which is really hard to keep and sustain as you're entering your studies. But yeah, I would use these random entry or random generated entries to actually just to kind of spur like my language learning, but also to be able to do like research and understand like how is this related to the work that I was currently doing, which was covering a couple different spaces. So I was into, I have a fine arts background. I was going into design, and then also which I don't know if that's stated very clearly, but I also work as an exhibition designer. So I had these three different areas where I was trying to figure out, what am I doing in all of this? But one thing here that I kept finding common is that I'd look onto this website and I'd see these characters that I couldn't recognize, and I couldn't find. I was doing the research, and I was finding out that these characters weren't actually like correct. So if we look at this word at the top in Jicarilla, it's goshtlish, and after the T you can see an A with the ring above, and that character is actually incorrect. So the actual character here at the bottom is that what I was looking for was a slashed L. And the only thing that I could really think of at the time, and while I was doing research, is that they designed the typeface incorrectly. And so I started, looking at the typeface. I also started looking at the website. And in having the opportunity to talk with the programmer for the project, he actually unpacked like what was going on. So we had to actually develop a keyboard for the website. And so you need the keyboard and the typeface in order to actually write the language. So if I didn't have the keyboard, or if I didn't have the typeface, I wasn't able to translate that this A with the ring above was actually an L with a slash. So I think that was one thing where I needed to actually figure out what was going on. But the reason that they did that is because it opened up real estate on our keyboard, so that if I wanted to easily like put this character, I could easily do it by doing this combination of like, button pushing. And so I think that was one way that they were going to make it easy, because if they didn't, they would have to figure out another solution on how to do that. So yeah, there's a couple characters like this, the A with the ring above, and then another character that made it easier for us to like write in Jicarilla. But yeah, showing both those comparative typefaces that I mentioned before with Arial and Times New Roman, this is kind of like an orthographic or like, semi like grammatical sketch of like what that looks like for our language. So we have the vowels A, E, I, O, and N. We also have rising and falling tones that are marked by those diacritic marks, and then long tones, which actually double those characters. And then we have a glottal stop, which if you're familiar with that, there is an actual glottal character, but that's not something that we actually utilize. We actually use the apostrophe in place of that, because it's not as easy to get a glottal mark, especially in our language when it comes up pretty often. And then in similarity to the Dene, we actually have a nasalization, which the Dene, they actually use an ogonek, which is this kind of like little hook at the bottom, which can be attached to the A or the I, but we don't actually use that. And a big kind of like reason that we don't use that is that we're trying to differentiate ourselves characteristically from the Dene. So it's a situation to where there was actually surveying and there was feedback from my tribe that we didn't necessarily want to use that same mark. We wanted to use a different mark. And I speak about this in some of my other talks on self-determination, but it's essentially being able to make that decision and being able to say like, hey, this is the direction we want to go with this. So like, how I'm defining this talk, my tribe was actually defining which orthography they wanted to choose going forward. So what I've used going forward, which is pretty, I guess more of like an accepted approach, is using this macron below, which is a below diacritic. If we look here at this blue lettering, there's actually a few different options that we have. So if we have this like line below, you could use the combining minus sign below, the combining low line, or just the low line. So even in that like decision, we have to make another like educated decision in how we want to like approach that. So that was one thing where when I'm doing this work with Beshi, I have to figure out like not only how that looks, but also like what are those coding points that we want to like utilize going forward as like a standard way of working. But here you can see those vowels and how they come into play as characters in the typeface. So A, E, I, O, N, and then having the above and below diacritics. And that really, wrapped up that project. So I think there was another typeface that I did, which was more experimental, which is a ligature typeface. But I think those are really interesting points of like research for me. And then when I finished actually the Beshi typeface, I actually typeset the dictionary in Beshi. So I think it was really kind of like looping around to that research and knowing that I have a better understanding of what that is, and yeah, kind of being more knowledgeable, even if I'm not like doing as much work as I'd like to be. I learned a lot through just that kind of phase of research. And then Beshi was actually named after, or it has roots in the Jicarilla language. So in Jicarilla, Besh means like knife or metal and tool. And that was one thing that I had to further define of like, well, how do I refer to typography in Jicarilla? Because we don't have a word for typography. So it's a situation where we have to define what that is. But I think, yeah, I'm getting better at like being more comfortable making decisions and like guiding people through this space. And here you can see just a look at that texture of how that look as a typeset content, right? So this is the pair story in Jicarilla. So you can see all the diacritics and the glottal stops, and then the unique characters where, if you did typeset something in Jicarilla, like this is how it would look. This is the character that we would be presenting, right? And because this is actually a product of the Czech Republic, it also has those capabilities too, right? So it has Czech language support, which it has something really interesting. If you look at these U's with the ring above, they're actually kind of like a ligature connected to those stems. So I think those are really interesting things that, if we looked closely at the design, really unique and beautiful. But yeah, this is the basic character set for that project, including figures and punctuation. And then also here's the expanded character set. So we have, all of those diacritics and special characters needed for language support, which this became like a larger part of that project, which I think is, if I'm going to preach about like language support, I really need to get used to working in those spaces. So I think this is great practice and kind of like moves me forward for the next projects that I take on. And yeah, this is the ligature font that I actually talked about earlier. So, if we're thinking about like systems and how we're working, the ligature font was actually designed to make it more easy to actually navigate all of these characters. So if I didn't have these ligatures, the actual alphabet for Jicarilla is something like 56 characters. So when I'm learning the language, I need to have remembered like all 56 of those characters and how they combine. So what I was thinking in this project was that, well, what if I simplify it? What if I connect those characters? And so it makes it simpler and easier for a student to actually learn what's going on with how these digraphs and trigraphs. So the digraph is when two different characters actually come together as one, or they're a unit. A trigraph is when three different characters become a unit. So you have these different like units or groups of characters, but we don't recognize how that works necessarily. And so I was thinking in this project, well, what if I just show that, and what if it's an automated thing? So as you type, those become grouped elements. So I think this is really interesting place for me, and just looking at it systematically. But when we get into that type space where we're programming again, only some of these are actually possible. So the glottal or those apostrophe characters, like those can actually be integrated into a ligature. Those are something that technically we're not able to do that currently. So those are things that I think about of like, not only the possibilities, but the limitations in this work. But I think this is very successful, and I really thought this was going to be like an innovation, in a lot of ways, which I'm still kind of figuring that out. But yeah, amongst like all this work, like I was still doing type design. I was actually designing exhibits. I worked at the Field Museum designing exhibits there and consulting with them. And then I was also doing my own work and my own research. So having those like material culture elements, like the pottery that I actually created, this research into typography, where I was looking at, stereotypes and tropes and representation, right? While also looking at, how that connection to me is, and the character on the right in the vinyl was something that's really close to home in my hometown, where those are things that are actually common and accepted. So, if we're talking about stereotypes, like how do I feel with putting that forward? What is that relationship to my practice, and how do I talk about it, or how do I question it, or how am I critical about it? And yeah, I worked also through a lot of other different typographic experiments, from looking at dictionaries, looking at different typefaces, looking at different concepts, both, within personal practice and research and publication, but also like commercial elements and education too, as well. So see, these are some of the pieces that I was kind of like exploring and trying to map for myself, and like, what am I doing in this work, and what's meaningful. But I think all of these have meaning in a lot of ways. And I think it really was a creative exercise in mapping the space, so that I know, like, if I ever go through this space again, like I have all these areas, I have all these avenues to go if I want to push this forward. And yeah, like things like these with the Indian market, which is actually an art festival in Santa Fe, being very critical of that, and also being able to voice, and express myself in those spaces. This one was just really reflective of education, right? And how are we putting those applications, or how are we putting that into the communities or into society, and having that as something that why would we be surrounding students with this work? But also, like, at some point the students have to take a seat, right? They have to enter those spaces. So it brings up those same issues again of like, well, after you might not have known, but now like, where do you go from there, right? And then where are you placing yourself in relation to all of this work? And this is one of the examples that I was just, I thought this was very communicative of what I was experiencing, where, we have it in a lot of places, and we just don't actually see it. But still we have a relationship to it, right? We're a society, and we have to kind of like take that place. We have to take responsibilities. We have to recognize all of those, just like the land acknowledgement, right? Like, what is our relationship, and being more conscious of that work. And this is a poster that I did in Chicago, but it was really navigating that space where, what is this, what is this presentation to society, and like, how do people look at not only indigeneity, but also like spirituality, and how that's kind of commodified now, or how commercial efforts, those aren't really things that I support. I think I haven't ever really worked in a commercial space. I've always worked in a nonprofit and a cultural community space. So I think those are the things that I see out there, and I'm able to be critical of. I'm able to critique, and also bring that into my work, right, and allow that to be part of it. And yeah, just getting more into those exploratory areas. Like, after creating the ligature font, I actually needed to figure out how I was going to present the work. So this is actually a rendering of that. So I had these ideas of putting together an exhibition, and I was putting together the exhibition space. I was putting together the material culture, and then also these innovations in type design. And so I was thinking about, like, well, what is that place for me? And I think that was really something that I was trying to figure out. But also, if we think about it critically, like, what does it mean to put language in an institution, right? What does it mean to institutionalize this language? because some of those things might not be like available, or it might be, you might not be privileged enough to like work with this space. So I think as far as a practitioner thinking goes, like those are things that I was thinking, well, what am I, what privilege do I have to put this into that space? And so those were a lot of thoughts that I was thinking about as I was going forward, while also like thinking about just myself too as well. So you talked about repatriation, right? Like, what does that mean to have like remains, cultural remains in an institution? And because I was working in that space of museums, it's something that's like, you walk down the hall and you could run into these things. So I kind of got used to it, of like, what ground am I navigating now, right? Like what battle are we like taking on, both in the museum space, but also in the design space as well. So I think those are things where, am I putting myself out there? Like, am I part of this work, right? Which the work actually ended up to be this work. So this is Hanasazani, and it's actually an installation into the foundation of the Art Institute. So because I was going to school at the Art Institute of Chicago, I thought that was a perfect venue for this piece. And I didn't find any like real obvious solution to until much later on in my explorations. And the concept for this was that I wanted the pottery and the ceramics to actually be melded into like a letter form. So the language that I was working with, that was actually something that was produced as ceramics. And in order for it to actually make like grounding and make space in that, I had to actually find ground. And so if I was in this museum space, it would be to actually cut out a piece of the museum foundation so that you can see the ground. You could see it, because being in Chicago, everywhere is cement. And so I didn't actually have a lot of like, access to just like raw, like nature. And so this was my effort in like doing that and connecting with the land, but also finding a place and finding belonging in that space, so where I could feel at home. I could feel like I belonged there, right, for that time being. And then Hanasazani is the actual title of it. It means the ones that emerge. So conceptually, it was like an emergence of language and being able to reconnect with the land, and being able to take language further, right, and in whatever form it might take going forward. So I think that was really something that I think was it was definitely necessary for my journey. And also along the way, I did things like these. So this is actually I kind of think of it as kind of like a collaboration with James Luna, who's actually a performance artist who passed away. So when I was going to school, James Luna actually passed away recently, and we wanted to commemorate him by doing an exhibition. So I told myself, well, I'm not, this isn't like coursework, this isn't like freelance work, but I wanted to do things, and it was really meaningful for me to take on this work and work with him to a degree. This kind of like graphic image at the center, which you might be familiar with, is actually a sculpture that's actually was created at the Art Institute. So it made a lot of sense to have these things in the Art Institute, and then also me being there, and also James being there as well. So it was just like crossing of paths where I felt like it was really influential. And aside from the actual development and design of the props, I actually did performance. So here you can see those graphic performances embedded within documentation that was pulled from the archives of the Field Museum. So these photos that are integrating with the performance, those are actually an individual from my nation who if you look here closely at the documents, it doesn't actually say who that is. So it's an unidentified individual who's of Jicarilla Apache descent. And for some reason, he was in this space, right? He was in Chicago, and they took these documentation. So I was further able to connect with another individual in that space, and yeah, and pull together those like avenues for practice. I also did these other performance pieces where I was actually looking into the archives at the Art Institute. So aside from doing these performances, which are, typographic kind of like concepts and explorations, I was actually digging or mining into the museum to see like what's there and what representation do we have in terms of contemporary or even historic indigenous like artifacts. So if you look at these call numbers and you look them up in the actual collections of the Art Institute, you can see what I was looking at and how I was placing those and playing with it. And then I also did things like these, which are, more motion graphics things where I felt like I needed to have that contemporary kind of like thing where I'm able to execute in those spaces, right? So this statement, Danjo, it actually means hello in Jicarilla. And I was wanting to do things like that where I felt, it was entering a different space for me, which I really appreciated. And soon after that, I got really into type design. So one of the first projects I did was this project called Danaza, which is it means our language in Jicarilla. And I had the same approaches of where like, okay, well, how do I add those diacritics, right? If I'm doing the technical side, how does that work? But also conceptually, putting the language out there and immersing people. And I was thinking this would ideally take place in my home community, but what does that mean to immerse ourselves in the language, right? Like, what if everything wasn't like anglicized, right? Or what everything wasn't in that English language? If it was in Jicarilla and we supported the language learning by changing the environment, that's what was really interesting to me for this piece. And so I think this is really successful in that way. And it also speaks towards like sovereignty, right? Like, so we don't always see those like signifiers. So if we enter another space, you might see that, but how are we taking control of that, right? And I think that was really interesting to take on. These are the last couple slides where I just wanted to show you some process work. So these are some of the, like, I guess, more experimental explorations. That these are all just scans of my sketchbook, which we were going through experimental processes during Type West. And yeah, I think, in terms of like understanding how we look at typefaces and how we're adding and subtracting weight and playing with the letter forms. I think those are all interesting like insights. It also like, encourages to, right, that we are active in our sketchbooks, right? We have an active sketchbook practice, and that even if there are things that are very simple like this, we understand those nuances in them, right? And those details that make them cohesive as a project. Like even this is a sketch, but it took me a long time to actually, do this very precisely, which I know like every kind of like area of this, and I can navigate that and put that forward. And then this is a typeface that I actually designed, which had to, because I had those talks with my students about like stereotypes. And so I showed the work of Angel Decora, which if you haven't looked up Angel Decora before, like definitely check that out. But I had to show them that, and I had to contrast that and like, well, what does that mean to represent a community, especially a cultural community, right? And like, how are we working with or like not working with, or how are we fighting against like stereotypes or generalizations or abstractions? So this is the typeface, which I call Pottery Sands, which is kind of like I don't know. It's just a little fun thing. It might not stick, but here it says Apache, and it's just this geometric typeface where I needed to communicate to my students of like, well, how do we generalize people? Like if this is going to represent my community as Jicarilla Apache, like, does it really represent them? And yeah, I think a lot of, especially with the land acknowledgement project, right? Like we don't want to, just take their visual language. Like we can't just like do that, right? Like we have to think of like, well, how are we being sensitive to that? How are we approaching that really very thoughtfully and respectfully? And so this project that I did, it was just kind of like things that I was seeing. So when I look up like Native American typography, I see these like, geometric like abstractions or generalizations of typefaces. And when I was thinking about that, like if we're looking at Beshi, like we don't actually see that, right? Like we see a different character that's put forward. When we look like this is similar to what you'll see out if I do like a search on like Pinterest or something like that of like Native American typefaces. Like this is exactly what you'll see. And this is what exactly I didn't want my students to be doing. So I had to actually design that and say, hey, like, don't do this, right? This might not be the best path forward, right? Take my advice. But this says a type design that meets the demand for ultra modern style and typography. So I think that was something that if you looked at some of my other work, that becomes like a repeated kind of theme, right? Like what is the ultra modern style in typography right now? And then for the conference that I did this fall that I helped with, which was the Egyptian conference, I actually gave a talk on self-determination, which I'm returning back to. It's, being able to voice those opinions, being able to make those decisions, being able to find that place for the designer, right? And what does your community need? And especially in terms of like in indigeneity and sovereignty, self-determination is right there, right? Like we need to know how to contribute to that space, how to make those decisions. But yeah, here you can see that, navigating that spectrum of abstraction to representation. And then what does that mean as an Indigenous or even Apache designer? Yeah, a couple weeks ago, I actually graduated from Type West. So I'm pretty happy about that, but I haven't like celebrated or anything because I'm still in the middle of the term. But I wanted to give you guys a look at that. So this is the final project for Type West, which is entitled Goni. Goni means news in Jicarilla. And so when we say like Abachi Goni, that means like the news. And I thought it was important for me to take on because we actually have a newspaper in Dulce where I'm from. And I thought it'd be ideal if I was able to like, possibly typeset or design a typeface for that newspaper. And so I had these different directions where it's going to be a text weight, but also it follows this kind of Clarendon style of typeface design, and that it also had that language support and then possibilities going forward, right? So not only having the regular, but the bold and italic for hierarchy, but also including things and directions like the stencil for, if the way that I equated it is that, say we needed to protest, right? Or there's a couple things that are happening now in Native America and even in Canada where, protest is a huge part of our communities as Indigenous peoples. And so we need typefaces for that. And so I was like, well, if I have to do a display version, it'll be a stencil so that people can actually feel that they can take ownership of that language and they can also use that in protest. So I thought that was really impactful for me to have that accessibility. And yeah, and the last thing, all that work with the Egyptian, we were actually able to put together the scholarship. So the Egyptian scholarship, which you can find amongst other scholarships at the Type Directors Club under scholarships.tdc.org. We have the Beatrice Ward scholarship, which is focused on women in type practices. And then the Ade Hogue which is another another scholarship that's available too as well. So really influential work. This is the first scholarship of its kind. So you know, if that is something that influences you or affects you, or you know someone that, you know, is in this similar space, definitely feel free to you know, share this work with them, because I do think it is very influential. And yeah, that's my presentation. Yihetin, which means thank you in Jicarilla. And you can also find me at Lower Earth Origin, which is my Instagram handle.